In this episode, we'll fix what's wrong with project management. Hello and welcome back to the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com. This is episode 510 and I'm Cornelius Fichtner. Thank you so much for stopping by. Don't forget, this is a video episode. So if you're only getting audio, then please visit pm-podcast.com/510 or pm-podcast.com/YouTube to play the video version. And yes, if you are on YouTube, then please do me the favor to like and subscribe. That really helps. Project management today is often seen as a maze of deadlines, scope, budgets, but at the heart of it, there's something deeper that frequently goes overlooked, and that's how we lead and engage our teams. Burnout, unclear priorities, and endless stress, they seem to come with the territory, yet many of these challenges are avoidable, so let's fix it with practical, human-centered strategies to turn project chaos into low-stress success. Joining us from Dublin today is James Lutit, a former CIO and project management expert who's experienced firsthand the pressures of complex projects and wrote about it in his book, Leading Impactful Teams. You can see that here on the left. Hello, James. Welcome to the
Cornelius.
program.
Yeah, very good to meet you, and thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course, of course. For those of you who don't know James, two-sentence introduction here. James Lutit is a former CIO and project management leader who, after experiencing severe burnout in 2016, developed practical techniques to reduce stress and enhance team effectiveness. He now works with top Irish companies using storytelling and memorable visuals to equip teams with tools for low-stress success. He is also the PMI Ireland Chapter Project Professional of the Year. You can learn more about him at impactfulpm.com. James, my first question for you, what can our audience expect to learn from our conversation today?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, I think project management is often overcomplicated, and there's so many different things that we can be doing. So I want to find ways of simplifying it down for people and helping them to really think about how they're managing their projects and spotting those little things that could go wrong and figuring out ways of dealing with them. So I'm going to talk a little about things like the lenses of project management. We're going to talk about managing risk, not just in the project team, but with your wider stakeholders as well. And hopefully give you some really practical techniques that I use every day with teams to help them get started on projects and get ideas out of their colleagues and really engage with the resources that they have available to them, their teams and their stakeholders.
All right, then. We are live at the moment, and we do welcome your questions. So if you are on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, or X, please use the chat. Send us your questions, and we will pick them up here in the program. James, this story begins with a burnout back in 2016. Please tell us what happened.
Yeah, so I suppose most of my career, I was like a lot of people, I kind of building bigger and bigger projects and various stages of seniority. And in 2016, I was managing a big financial regulation project for a big bank here in Ireland through the consultancy that I was working for. And I was running a team of big enough team based in Ireland, the UK, and in India. Really complex projects. One of those ones where, you get a load of regulatory requirements and a really big complicated organization, and you try and jam the two together and try and figure out all the things that have to happen. One of those ones, big complicated thing. But I was also managing as the head of what we call the analysis and design competency for the bank, and I was also the client data protection lead. So I had all these kind of +1 things that we were doing. But at home, I was also we had 3 young kids. They were very young at the time, under the age of 5 at one stage, just older than that in 2016, in May 2016. And over the course of a week, I went through this story, and I describe it at the beginning of my book, and I'm told it's a bit of a page turner, not the usual introduction to a project management book. But I started with a headache, and by the end of the week, I was feeling this huge pressure and stress, and I couldn't find ways of dealing with it. And on the Friday morning, we had a big senior manager meeting, and right at the beginning of the meeting, I went up to my boss's boss, and I told him, Carl, if you don't let me, I need to spend the next 20 minutes talking about my mental health, and if you don't let me, I'm going to resign immediately, and I'm going to tell everyone it's because you wouldn't let me talk about my mental health. He didn't know me that well. He was relatively new in his job, and he was my boss's boss. But to his eternal credit, he said, James, do what you need to do. I've got you. I trust you. And then I kind of proceeded to spread all this stuff that I was thinking about, all the worries that I had, all the stress from the project and the kids and everything that was going on. And then the next morning, and with that, actually, the pressure came off. The corporate machine kicked in. I was told to take some time off, and the support really was there for me. But the next morning, it turned out I started behaving very, very oddly. And they called it a psychotic episode. I ended up running around the village here where I live, shouting very odd things. And I was rushed off to hospital. And it turns out that I had, by that stage, a very severe case of viral meningitis. So there was huge pressure. The pressure I was feeling was actual physical inflammation in the meninges around my brain. And really, it was coming out of that experience that made me stand back and think about the pressure that we put on ourselves and the effort that we put in. And I realized that actually there's better ways of doing this stuff, or there must be better ways of doing this stuff. So I went and found out what they were. Loads and loads of research. I did my PMP, but I also did Scaled Agile Framework, and I did my Scrum Master and all these other different things, and figured out really interesting ways of doing things. And I started teaching those things within the consultancy that I was working for, and I absolutely loved it.
Yeah. Before we get into what did you do differently, let's take a step back. What were the mistakes that you think you made that led up to that episode for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge piece there around the pressure that we all put on ourselves. So for intelligent, hardworking, creative people, like most project managers that I certainly meet are, there's an infinite amount of work. And managing that infinite amount, there's always something you can do. There's always another phone call you can make, another meeting that you can set up, and another thing that you can do to drive forward the goals of your project. And without putting some clarity over prioritization of what needs to be done and making that really clear to the people who are not necessarily deliberately, but inevitably putting on pressure for you to achieve whatever it is that you need to achieve, if you don't make it clear to them what's happening and the decisions that they need to make to support you, then I think that can cause a huge amount of stress in teams. And so the practical techniques that I wanted to find out are really how to make sure we're not going to talk today about mindfulness and about exercise and sleep and those kind of things, which are very powerful, and other people are experts in those things. I'm talking today about managing stress before it becomes stressful, right? Managing the amount of work that you do and that your team do, and having great conversations about the decisions that are being made in your organization.
All right.
And I don't think I was doing that particularly well back in 2016.
So that's the beginning of the story, but there's more to it, because from your point of view, what is wrong with project management? Why does this kind of stuff happen? Why do we put so much stress on ourselves?
Yeah, I think one of the things that a lot of organizations try and do is they try and solve real project and people problems with process. And it's quite a common thing where the PMO, the project management office, come in and they start imposing things on projects, because they think that by forcing people to, let's say, have a risk log or a plan or a status report, they're going to make those projects more effective. And I would advocate for all of those things in the right places. But the problem that happens is the organization then looks at whether you've got a risk log or whether you've got a status report, and not whether you're managing risk and whether you're communicating well with your stakeholders. And I think we sometimes focus too much on the thing and not the outcome or the reason that we're doing the thing. And I think that's a huge part of the stresses and strains, particularly in big organizations when we're managing projects like this. So we try and fix things with PMO or with kind of process, following a methodology, rather than empowering our team, training them and helping them to give them really clever and creative ways to solve their problem. And then the other thing that always happens, very often happens, talk about prioritization, and people do this thing called Moscow prioritization. You must know about Moscow prioritization, Cornelius, and where you do must, should, could, won't, and you kind of prioritize things like that. And you say, these are all the musts, and these are all the things we would like to do if we should be doing, and these are all the things we could do, and these are all the things we won't be doing, right? And the trouble with that is people who've done this before, they realize that they're not going to put anything in the shoulds and coulds, and definitely not in the won'ts, because those things are all going to get de-scoped when the difficult conversation happens. So what you end up with is this big bucket of must. And within the bucket of must, things don't get prioritized. And for me, that's fundamental to the success of most projects, is how do you go about actually making sure that the right people are making decisions about what is done, and more importantly, what is not done.
Mm-hmm. All right. I'm fully with you there. I used to work for a large bank here in the United States, and the PMO required us to fill in pages after pages after pages. And I am not kidding you. I printed out all the various plans and documents they wanted us to fill in, double-sided, roughly 500 pages. And they required that for every single project, no matter the size and everything. And my department, we did mostly small projects, so it was my job to reduce that, and it's one of the big successes in my career. I managed to reduce all of that onto a single page. Amazing. So the 500-page template to a single page, because I could show we don't need this because we're doing this differently in our department. And so in the end, it was approved. But that then led to, the project managers just, being checkbox people, right? Yeah. Okay, I have to fill in this checklist that Cornelius made. So I'm just going to do the conversations I need to have so I can check it off, instead of having these conversations in order to be successful on the project. So it's a very, very similar situation, right? It doesn't matter in the end if you have a single page or if you have 500 pages. If you become a robot project manager, well, it doesn't help your project, because you're just following the process rather than using this as an opportunity to really learn from your stakeholders. What is it you want, right?
Yeah. A friend of mine calls it apparatchik project management.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Oh, yes.
Bureaucrats in sort of Soviet Russia, they're following it because they'll get in trouble if they don't follow the thing. And they don't care whether the thing's any good or not.
Right. Okay, so that's it for the problem then. Now, how did you come up with a solution? What kind of solution do you see here in this world?
Yeah, so I went away after this episode, and I learned everything I could. So I did do my PMP, but I also learned a load of stuff about agile, a load of stuff about design thinking and behavioral psychology and facilitation techniques and nudge theory and how people really behave, and starting to bring all these things from different worlds into what we were doing on projects. And it was really interesting because I then had a role as the project management competency lead. So my job was to help everybody else to figure out all of the hard things that they were doing. And all the relationships and all the difficulties and all the real challenging stuff. And it was wonderful. So people kept on coming to me with all these really interesting questions. And what I figured out is transparency of the decision making and empowering and using your team really, really well and helping them to get better every day or every week is really the best way to solve it. So if you take something like the prioritized backlog on Scrum, right, which I'm sure most of your listeners will know about, And use that as something to hang your hat on, right? So when you're having discussions about what we should be doing, if you think about actually having a prioritized list of this and then this and then this, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so you don't have any equals. The skill in this thing, in prioritizing things, is you don't allow any equals. And what I teach on my training course is how to articulate the business value of one of the changes. So we actually do some examples and we figure out if it's a risk reduction or if it's for the purposes of, of saving time, or even if it's for, GDPR purposes or something like that. Still put a number on it in terms of the value, and then estimate the effort really, really well using tools like planning poker and things like that, and planning things out. And once you have those things, you can actually use them to make good prioritization decisions from the context of what's good for the organization, as opposed to what's good for one individual who wants something. And all of a sudden, when you do that and you bring that out into the open, it becomes a really powerful tool for engaging your stakeholders. Because instead of them having to come and force their way in using their political power and will to make something happen, because they're just trying to jam it into an ever bigger pile of must, you can actually have a transparent conversation with everybody, show everybody where it fits in to what's going on, and then say, yeah, do you know what? Actually, your thing is good, but it's not as good as this thing, or as easy to do as this thing, and therefore it fits in after that. And people can see that. And all of a sudden, they feel like they're being listened to, and they've got a chance to put their thing in at the right time. So you've got much better control of scope, and you've got much better engagement with your stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Most of the tools that you've mentioned so far, the prioritized backlog, planning poker, they all seem to tend to lean towards agile practices. I would assume that what you're getting at is not just for agile. We're not saying, oh, switch over to agile, it's so much better. Those were just the examples.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So the point here is that it's about using. So I believe that agile and predictive, I think is what they call it in PMP.
Yes.
Is they're not mutually exclusive. They're both amazing tools, right? So let's understand all the tools in this world, and let's understand all the tools in that world. And like, for example, if you think that a daily stand-up is a good tool, doesn't matter whether you're running agile or waterfall, use a daily stand-up. It's a good tool, exactly. Yeah. Right? If you think that a risk log is a good tool, doesn't matter if you're managing agile or waterfall, use a risk log. And I think that's something like this, which is just a prioritized list. And you can then take that list and you can estimate it and you can plan it out on a big, long, Gantt chart and figure out where everything's are and the dependencies and all that stuff between it. That's okay. I'm not saying that's, in fact, that's one of the things I teach on my training course. The key is that you're having a discussion about what's in and what's out using really good language.
Mm-hmm. We've got one comment or one question rather that's coming in here from Sushil Gupta. Hello, Sushil. Welcome back to the program. He's been a guest previously. And his question is this: what is the methodology for stress-free projects? I think the answer is probably, well, it depends. It depends on where your stress is actually coming from and what causes you personal stress, and then figuring out what you need to do in order to de-stress it. Would you say that that's kind of the first step?
I'd say learn several.
Okay.
I'd say exactly that. Learn several methodologies and understand the one that's going to be right for your project in your organization with your team. And then take the right bits from the right places. Right? So I would argue that I think if you're trying to get a methodology to fix your problem, you're going to struggle, right? Because it won't. The skill is in the team and empowering them and getting great ideas, facilitating that and having great discussions with your stakeholders. And all of the methodologies can support those. And also they can all support the exact opposite. You can be very stressed under all of the methodologies as well.
Mm-hmm. His question kind of triggered something in my head just now, because we're making it say, just, use this, use that, use the other. But what's the conversation with your prescriptive PMO going to be like? Because, well, they're still like, you have to use a risk log. You have to use that. You must do this. You must do that. This is the way we do project management. What does that conversation look like? When you're saying, well, I want to do something different. I don't want to do what you prescribed that I do. What does that conversation look like with the PMO? Do you have any experience in that? Getting them to change?
Yeah. So what I'd say there is there's a wonderful 3-letter word that you can use in this situation. It's why. Why am I filling this in? So go back to them and say, if they're asking you to fill in a risk log, for example, and you say, why do I need to fill in a risk log? Is anybody else going to look at it? Right. And you can get into a little bit of that. And a bit like you did, because I did something very similar actually at the organization that I was working at, is once you start asking why, you say, hang on, why is this document, how is this document adding value? You start to open up a conversation about, well, maybe it isn't. And all of a sudden you can actually tweak and change the document and maybe take it on yourself to say, no, do you know what? That's not adding value. Let's get rid of this. But the other thing is, a risk log is hugely valuable if it's used well to manage risk, not just manage risks, but also to make risks clear to people. And if that's not what's being used, then you've got a chance to push back and say, hang on a second, I'm going to fill this in if we're having a conversation, a proper conversation about risks at steering. And if that's the case, then I'll use the tool. And I think sometimes there's a confidence that you get from understanding different methodologies and different approaches to things, that you can then challenge back and say, well, hang on a second, I don't see the value in this. Please, can you explain to me why it's valuable? It's not valuable because just I don't understand why it's valuable. And then see if anybody can answer that question. And if nobody can, then you get to get rid of the thing.
All right. So there we go. That's part of the solution. And we're moving on to here contingency, because one tool in your book is called contingency. What do you mean by contingency, and how would we use it?
So this is one of the most misunderstood and misused tools that I think most project managers have. So what happens with contingency is it's used in one of two ways, right? So when you're estimating something, you estimate your project. Let's say you're going to say the project is going to cost 100,000 euros, and then you add 10% contingency. So there's this kind of context of like industry standard contingency. Have you ever heard that? Industry standard contingency.
I've done that myself.
and it's awful, right? Because what industry, what standard, where did you get this from? It doesn't make any sense. And what happens if you say industry standard contingency is the stakeholder who's going to pay for the contingency says, why? And all of a sudden you haven't got any reason for it. You can't justify it. So it gets cut and you don't end up having contingency. The other way that contingency works in most places is that people realize that stuff can go wrong. So they need to add some contingency into it. But it's not explicitly made clear that that's why you're adding it. So what happens is you go to, let's say you're working with an IT team. You go to the developer and say, how long is it going to take us to do this thing? And they say, well, they think to themselves, well, it's going to take 2 days to do the thing, but stuff might go wrong. So I'm going to say 3 days, right? Because that'll give me a bit of space just in case stuff goes wrong. I don't want to get told off, right? And then the team lead takes that look at that and they say, well, 3 days, okay, but I've seen this stuff before. Stuff goes wrong. So I'm going to tell the project manager 5 days because, I don't want to get my team to be stressed or pressured. And then the project manager takes that and he looks at it and says, okay, the development team think it's going to take 5 days, but hang on a second, stuff might go wrong. And they put in and they say it's going to take 2 weeks. And all of a sudden, as a stakeholder, as a senior person, you look at this estimate. Why is it taking my development team 2 weeks to do something that should only take a couple of days? It's really straightforward. And that's natural behavior if you don't allow a discussion about the risks and things that could go wrong on the project. So what I advocate, and I believe it's there in PMP, it's just really well hidden because everyone's spending so much time learning how to pass the exam, is this idea of risk-based contingency. So rather than having a percentage on the project, which is really difficult to justify, you call out individual risks. If we don't get sign off by this date, we're going to fail to hit the Christmas outage window, and therefore we're going to have to go live in Easter, which is going to cost us $95,000, right? And then you say it to the stakeholder, like this is what could go wrong if you don't do this thing, and all of a sudden the stakeholder is like much more interested in signing off on the thing before the date, and therefore you never have to spend the contingency. So you use it to have a much better conversation with your stakeholders about what could go wrong and helping to stop that stuff from going wrong. And it's really empowering for teams, because if you're actively going to them and saying, well, how can we help and what could go wrong, and you give them this mechanism that they can show the organization, then all of a sudden you'll find your projects are much, much better, because the things that could go wrong get managed with the support of the organization and not just hidden within the team that have to then stress about it and solve it all internally.
Mm-hmm. And the contingency you're talking about, are we only talking about monetary contingencies here, or are we also talking about schedule contingencies?
Yeah, I talk about both. So,
okay.
So depending on what the impact is, it might be financial, it might be schedule, or it might be both. So call that out and make it clear. Now, the skill here is you can only do this with a relatively small number of things, right? If you try and go into too much detail on this, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So you've got to do it with the big stuff that your stakeholders have got. You're using it as a way of having that conversation with your stakeholders and getting their support on it.
Yeah, I was just going to go there, because I have seen risk logs with 300, 400 items on it. And if you have to do this and have this conversation with everything on there, it's going to be really messy. Do you have a sort of a cutoff point, 80-20 rule, or how would you do this?
Anything that's keeping you or your team awake at night would be pretty good.
Anything
pretty
that
good
causes
benchmark.
you stress. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Share the load and make it clear to the organization. Because most of those risks on a 300 line risk log, they're not real risks, right? They're stuff that either perhaps is in the control of the team, or is not being managed, is left over from an old risk log, hasn't been thought about, it's not really live, whatever. It's more to do with it being up to date than anything else. So I'd be concentrating really, really carefully on the big stuff for this week's status meeting, for this week's steering meeting, and making sure that people are really clear. Or if we're doing a QBR or a budget, the big stuff that can genuinely impact the overall timeframes of the project. Costs.
My last PMP exam prep course update project had the risk in it. Cornelius gets hit by a bus.
Yes.
Could happen. Yes, I could fall ill. Something could happen to me, but it's such a minuscule risk in the end. Yeah.
I prefer win the lottery, actually, to get hit by a bus. I think that's a much nicer conversation. But yes, you're right.
That's a more positive way of looking at it. All right.
But that key person risk is one that comes up very often. And the thing is, by making it very clear to people what the cost associated with that is, all of a sudden the creative solution comes out. So if you've got a key person risk, like then what you can do is say, well, hang on a second, how do we mitigate that? Well, let's get a person sitting next to that person, learning from them over and over again and getting better at stuff. And then that over time, that mitigates that key person risk, for example.
All right. So that was contingency. And then let's move on to Sixth Sense. And I want to read something here that I noted because it says this about your book. Leading impactful teams is a lively exploration of the lenses of project management: scope, prioritization, time, cost, quality, risk, team, and stakeholders that will enable the reader to develop a sixth sense for potential issues that could derail the project. James, what does this sixth sense look like? I think we have. There you go, James. You're back on.
I think I can hear you again now.
We have a bad connection here between Tucson, Arizona, and Dublin. Right. So the question was about the sixth sense.
The sixth sense.
Yes, that your book is mentioning. What does the sixth sense look like?
Yeah, so for me, there's these. So experienced PMs have this kind of like, they sniff it out, don't they? They spot that there's a stakeholder over there who's maybe not behind, the idea that they're going, that they're trying to solve for, or that there's a cost implication on something that comes out in the planning. And for me, what I wanted to do is give people just those lenses. Very simple. It's just 8 words: scope, time, cost, quality, team, stakeholder, risk, and then prioritization. just those 8 words that people can think every time they look at a plan, every time they look at a document, or every time they speak to their team. Hang on a second, is there a risk here? Hang on a second, is there a cost implication? Is there a quality implication? And just have those on a post-it note by their desk that they can just keep checking back in with those things. And whenever they spot something in the context of a discussion, maybe about scope, that has an implication on a stakeholder, and go, hang on a second, take a note, I'm going to pick up the phone to that person, right? And that's what I mean by the sixth sense. It's understanding all of those angles on the projects and how they interact with each other, and the levers that you've got to pull to make it. And that's where the really experienced PMs who've been around like you and me tend to be much better. But you can approximate it by having just those 8 words and thinking about all the different angles of what could go on.
Yeah, because that was sort of the critique that popped up in my head about this approach. Because yes, you and I, we have so much experience. We look at something, we go, this is where another project of mine failed. Better be careful. Whereas a junior project manager, even if they have these post-it notes all over their desk, they're looking at scope and they're like, yeah, I can't really imagine what might go wrong, right? And this is where the sixth sense sort of and experience needs to meld into one, and you need to be able to come up with a, you know what, something might go wrong here. But I think it's more difficult for junior project managers, isn't it?
It's definitely more difficult for junior project managers, but I think you can approximate it. And reading books like mine, but there's lots of other great books out there, just constantly feeding your brain all the thinking around this stuff, listening to your podcasts, that will help people get better at spotting this stuff. So I on my training course, I do a thing with balloon animals about, we call it growth mindset. And I teach people how to do that and prove to them that something they didn't know before that they do know now. And for me, that idea of having a growth mindset, which is that I can always learn something. It's so easy to learn stuff now, right? You can learn things and constantly looking for ways to learn and get better at things. And quite quickly, I think I see junior people going through that process. You might be 25 or 26, but you could be better at spotting some of this stuff than someone who's 40 or 50 years old and has been around the block, but had their eyes closed most of the time and didn't read a book in between.
All right. We're moving on from the sixth sense to our final topic here. And that topic is SAVE. SAVE, all capital. So some of the tools that you discuss in the book: caves, commons, collaborations and contemplation, lean coffee, raid logs, planning poker. The list goes on and on and on. And SAVE is one of the tools that you describe in the book. What is SAVE? And can you tell me how SAVE would save me from having a burnout myself?
Yeah. So I'll start with this, which is have you heard of the HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion?
No, I have not.
So I actually have a little HIPPO. I kind of carry it around with me.
Okay.
The highest paid person's opinion. And it's a really dangerous thing on a project. And very often as the project manager, you are, if not the highest paid, then at least one of the most experienced people on the project. And senior people, I do a lot of work with C-suite executives and very senior people. And they quite often come to me, James, how do I get my team to give me their ideas? And the answer to that question is shut up and ask them. But people find that very, very hard to do. So I went away and when I was doing some of my research on design thinking, and I've used this ever since. This is going back, 5 or 6 years. I've used this ever since. I came across this concept of silent writing. And what it is let's say you're trying to do a risk identification session. You want to find out what could go wrong on the project, right? If you sit in a team of 5 people and you say, what could go wrong on the project? One person, probably the most experienced person, is going to say, well, I think this could go wrong. And you'll have a big discussion about that thing. And you'll get to the end of the meeting and you'll have identified one risk. Brilliant. Whereas if you do something just very simple, instead of that, you say to the guys, right, here's a stack of Post-it notes each and a pen. And you say, guys, everybody write down what could go wrong on the project, right? What are the risks, right? And then you invigilate it like silent writing. So it's like exam conditions. Nobody's allowed to talk. No copying. I want your ideas, not the person next to you or the most experienced person. I want your ideas. and you let that go for only 5 or 7 minutes. It doesn't take very long. And all of a sudden what happens is people sort of look off into the distance, and this weird thing happens. Their brains start working and they start writing things down, and all these things, whether they're tasks or risks or stakeholders that need to be thought about, appear on these post-it notes. So that's the S, silent writing, and it's hugely powerful. But then what you do is, as the facilitator of that, you then say, okay, well, we need to look for themes, and we're going to need to figure out how, because you're going to have loads and loads of ideas and they're unstructured. So then you can do a thing called affinity clustering. And again, it's just a design thinking technique that I learned. And you stand up and you say, okay, first person, often the most junior person, you say, we're looking for the right answer here, the overall right answer, not, I don't really care where the ideas came from. So would you start and tell us what you think might go wrong on the project? And they're going to say, well, we're not going to get access to that person, or we're not going to get sign off for that thing, or the vendor's not going to bring whatever it is, or there's going to be a problem with the server, or whatever, right? And you start putting these up on the board in this kind of clusters. And then what you'll see is, as you go around the rest of the team, a few of them will have been called out several times, and there'll be 1 or 2 that are only called out once. And that's where the real gold comes, because that's something that would have stayed inside that person's brain and never been aired if you hadn't done something like this. And then what you can do, there's lots of ways to prioritize things. And like I said earlier, like value and effort, I think is really, really powerful. Sometimes you can just go to the boss and say, what do you think the priority is? But in this case, using a democratic technique like voting, you can say, okay, guys, here's, give everybody 5 votes each. You can get those little sticky dots, or just use a pen, and you give 5 people 5 votes each. What do you think the biggest risk is, or the highest impact is going to be? And then people vote, and all of a sudden you count up the votes, and all of a sudden you've got this most amazing thing, a prioritized list of your risks or your tasks or your stakeholders, the most urgent ones to speak to. And then, so you've done silent writing, affinity clustering, voting, and then you just take that list and execute. SAVE, save.
All right, thank you. And you'll see me furiously writing, because I got it wrong. Execute. There you go. I took a Post-it note myself to start writing it down to make sure I had it. So it's start in writing, affinity clusters, and then voting and executing. I thought it was value and effort at first, because you mentioned value and effort. It's also V&E, right? So
yes.
start in writing.
I suppose that might work actually. You could identify the tasks and then do value and effort. That's it could have gone that way when I was writing the book. To be honest. But I do it this way a lot, and it works really, really well for people.
All right. Wonderful. Yeah. I did this once, and it was in a very male-dominated kind of environment, and it didn't go over well. The start in writing and the affinity clusters. People were just, at that time, I must have been ahead of my time. My time. It just didn't work. They didn't come out of their shells. Very little actually came from it. But I think that was back in the early 80s, mid 80s, something like that. And since then, we've moved along, and these type of techniques are much more often used by people. So we're used to it.
And I think how you introduce it matters as well. So whenever I'm talking about the SAVE technique, I always start with the hippo, because it kind of disarms people. Yes. Right? It registers the fact that you're an important, like whoever the hippo, it's the hip that's the person. The hippo is their opinion. But whoever the hip is in the room, you're kind of registering that fact, and you're saying, do you know what, you really are important, and we are, your ideas are often very, very right, and we need them. They're absolutely crucial to this, but we also want everybody else's ideas as well. And I haven't come across anybody, when you introduce it like that actually rails against it. And I think
looking back, that might have been my problem. I was a junior project manager there, and I was trying something new that had never been done before, and probably didn't introduce it right. And everybody else was like, what is this guy doing? We're moving on from saving to taking things away. James, what are the 2, maybe 3 takeaways from our conversation, other than go read my book, that you want our audience to think about and start applying on their projects?
I think that thing around transparent and proactive prioritization, deciding the things in order of what needs to be done. And this works very, very well at senior levels, at board level, even in organizations, all the way down through the project team, all the way down to an individual. What am I going to work on this week? Right. So understanding and being really clear and transparent about what it is that you're working on and what you're not working on, and allowing that to form a conversation. And to do that, you need to be able to estimate things, both value and effort. But once you have that as a backbone, it's really powerful for your teams and your stakeholders. So that would be one thing that I'd love to see people do. The other thing is that idea that you're not going to solve things with methodology. Each of the methodologies has great power. But if you look at something like PMP, by definition, it's not really, in my view, it's not a methodology. It's a toolbox, right? It's lots and lots of powerful, useful things. And we even call it a body of knowledge, don't we? And it's having and building those skills and figuring out how you're going to apply them, because your project is different than everybody else's. Your team is different than everybody else's, and understanding and what you're doing is different. So understanding what's going to be useful to you and having the confidence to start doing some of these techniques. And you can still write it up in the PMO mandated risk log if you need to, but understanding that you can be creative and use these tools yourself.
Excellent. Thank you so much, James, for stopping by today. And we really appreciate your insights. Thank you.
It's been a lot of fun, Cornelius, and I'm delighted to have been on. I've been watching the podcast with interest for a long time, and I'm delighted to finally be on it. Thank you.
Glad you did. And with that, we are coming close to the end. As a reminder, the book is called Leading Impactful Teams: Achieving Low-Stress Success in Project Management, written by James Lutet. It is 213 pages long and published by De Gruyter Books. And I did say it's 213 pages, but for those of you who prefer listening over reading, the book is available as an audiobook on Audible. Go check it out. And it is also supposed to come to Spotify. James is working on that as well. Please do visit pm-podcast.com/510 for show notes, transcripts, and PDU information. Regarding the PDUs, you will most likely be able to earn 0.75 PDUs in the Power Skills category. Our email address is info@pm-podcast.com. And finally, we have this. In project management, we don't make mistakes, just highly informative learning experiences. Until next time.